The winter night was silent, until Shadow, a German shepherd, sensed something no human could. Mark Dawson, a weary veteran rebuilding his life, followed him into the storm, only to find a cabin torn apart, a map marked with danger, and a message from someone who seemed to know him. But who left that map? Who tried to silence an old engineer beneath the ice? And why is a man who vanished 20 years ago suddenly controlling the town from the shadows? Every clue Shadow uncovers leads Mark deeper into a truth someone is desperate to hide. And tonight, you and I step into that mystery together. Before we begin, may this story keep your heart warm wherever you are. Share with me. From what corner of the world are you watching? And if these journeys touch you, I'd be honored to have you subscribe and walk with us. The winter wind carved through the Montana Valley like a blade of cold iron. Snow slid across the frozen highway in sheets of white. Pines bent under the storm's weight, and the world felt small, muted, as if every sound had been pulled underground. In this silence, a man and his dog stood at the edge of another long night. Mark Dawson tightened the frayed collar of his work jacket as he stepped out of the small rental cabin he called home. At 48, he carried the rugged lines of a life spent fighting wars abroad and hardship at home. His face bore a stern yet tired strength, with a jaw roughened by a day-old beard and eyes that held both quiet kindness and the trace of someone who had seen more than he ever wanted to remember. His dark blonde hair, streaked with early gray, curled slightly under the hood he rarely bothered to raise. Years in Afghanistan had carved something permanent into him, a stillness when most people panicked, and a wariness that never fully left even in moments of peace. Beside him padded Shadow, the German shepherd who had become the only steady anchor in his drifting life. Shadow was large but lean, with a sleek black and tan coat and intelligent amber eyes that flicked toward every shift in the wind. His ears stayed upright, scanning the world with instincts sharpened by both training and survival. Mark found Shadow 6 years earlier on an abandoned military road in Kandahar, a half-starved young dog pacing beside a wrecked vehicle. They had recognized something familiar in each other, loneliness perhaps. And since then, the two had rarely spent a night apart. Tonight, Mark prepared for another 12-hour shift at the fuel pipeline inspection yard. The pay was meager, but the hours kept him occupied, and routine kept his mind from wandering to darker places. He had returned home from war with no close family left, no savings, and no plan beyond finding a job that would not require talking much to anyone. Shadow, on the other hand, never let him forget that the world still contained things worth noticing. The dog nudged him now, a gentle push of reassurance, and Mark gave a slow exhale. He locked the cabin and began walking through the storm toward his truck. But halfway across the yard, Shadow froze. The dog's hackles rose like bristles, and a low growl trembled from his throat. Mark stopped. He knew this sound. It was not fear. It was warning. Shadow lifted his nose toward the tree line on the far side of the property, where the wind cut through the pines and darkness pooled like spilled ink. The storm had not yet reached its peak, but the snow fell thick enough to blur shapes and swallow footprints. Even so, Shadow stepped forward, muscles taut, gaze fixed on something Mark could not see. Mark hissed softly. Shadow rarely misread danger, and he never reacted this sharply unless something was deeply wrong. A moment later, the German shepherd let out a long, piercing howl. It was a sound Mark had heard once before, on a night halfway across the world, seconds before a roadside explosion changed the entire direction of his unit. That memory crashed over him. The ringing ears, the dust, the shouting, the blinding flame. His chest tightened as if the cold air had sharpened into knives. Then Shadow bolted, not toward the truck, not toward the road, but straight into the forest. Mark swore under his breath and sprinted after him, boots crunching through snow. Shadow moved with purpose, weaving through pines that bent beneath the storm. The deeper they went, the quieter the world became, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. Shadow stopped abruptly in a small clearing, and that was when Mark saw it. A cabin, old, isolated, barely more than a shack, stood crooked at the clearing's edge. The front door hung broken from one hinge. The window shutters flapped in the wind. Snow had blown inside through the shattered glass, dusting the floor in a pale layer. Something about the place felt wrong. Not abandoned, but violated. Shadow stepped inside first, nose twitching, every sense alert. Mark followed, switching on the small flashlight he kept clipped to his jacket. The beam cut through the gloom and revealed overturned chairs, scattered tools, and papers strewn across the floor. The cabin looked as though someone had searched it in a panic, or destroyed it in anger. Then the light found the table. A map lay spread across it, pinned down by a rusted wrench. Old creases ran through the paper, but bright red ink had been added recently. Lines and circles marking sections of the underground fuel pipeline that stretched across the valley. Some areas were labeled with single words: corrosion, leak, unstable. Next to one point on the map, a date was written. It had passed 3 days earlier. Mark felt his pulse thrum in his neck. He had inspected those same sections countless times. If what this map suggested was true, the pipeline was deteriorating far faster than anyone at the company had admitted. A major leak, even a rupture, could devastate the entire region with fire, contamination, or worse. Shadow pawed at the table, drawing Mark's attention to the sheet beneath the map. It was a note, scribbled hastily on lined paper. If you find this, save the town before it's too late. The handwriting was shaky, uneven, as if written by someone who did not have time to steady their hand. Mark scanned the cabin again, trying to piece together who might have left it. A work coat lay draped over a chair. The size suggested a man in his 50s or 60s. A mug of coffee sat half-frozen on the counter. Whoever had been here was taken or forced out recently. Shadow whined, moving toward the back of the cabin. Mark followed the dog's gaze to a set of deep claw marks gouged into the inside of the doorframe. They were recent, violent, and not made by any dog. Mark's mind tightened into focus. Training took over. Someone had been dragged from this place. He had no idea who, no idea why. But the town he worked in, the same town that barely acknowledged his existence, might now be in danger because of whatever was marked on this map. Shadow nudged the note again. Mark folded it carefully and tucked it into his jacket. His breath turned to mist in the cold air as he whispered into the dim cabin light. Whoever you are, I hope you're still alive. He did not yet know that this was only the first thread in a web of secrets that stretched back decades. He did not yet know that the pipeline he inspected every day was more fragile than anyone dared admit. He did not yet know that someone in town was willing to do anything to bury the truth. But Shadow knew danger was coming. And tonight, the storm was only the beginning. The storm thickened as Mark and Shadow left the ruined cabin behind. the map and the desperate note weighing heavily in Mark's pocket. The forest swallowed sound, leaving only the crunch of boots and the steady rhythm of Shadow's paws breaking through the crusted snow. Mark tried to steady his breathing, but the questions circling in his mind burned hotter than the cold could numb. Someone had struggled in that cabin. Someone had marked those dangerous pipeline sections. Someone had been taken, and whoever they were, they had left a plea that now sat in Mark's hands like a burden he had never asked for. Shadow suddenly halted. His body tightened, ears pricking straight upward. A low growl vibrated from his chest before he stepped forward cautiously, nose sweeping across the ground. Mark shone his flashlight where Shadow focused. A thin red smear streaked across the snow, already half hidden beneath the falling flakes. Blood. Fresh enough that the storm had not erased it entirely. Shadow let out a frustrated bark and followed the trail, weaving through broken branches and uneven terrain. Mark hurried after him, his boots slipping on patches of ice. Every instinct from his deployment years rose to the surface. He scanned the woods, expecting movement in the corners of his vision that never fully appeared. The cold heightened every sound, every breath, every shift of snow falling from branches overhead. After several minutes, the trees opened into a narrow ravine. A battered pickup truck lay below them. Its front half plunged into a frozen creek. Its back wheels pointed toward the sky like a toppled insect. Snow clung to the dented metal, and the cracked windshield glittered faintly under Mark's flashlight beam. Shadow barked sharply and slid down the shallow slope, paws skidding. Mark followed him with cautious steps, testing each patch of ice. When he reached the driver's door, he saw the glass had shattered inward. A hand lay slumped across the steering wheel. Mark yanked the frozen door open. Inside, an elderly man struggled for breath, slumped sideways. His face was gaunt, lined with years of labor and sleepless nights. Deep wrinkles framed a pair of blue eyes clouded with pain, but still burning with focus. His white hair, once neatly combed, now hung in uneven streaks across his forehead. His beard was short but unkempt, and his cheeks were marked by frostbite's early touch. The man wore a heavy work coat with an embroidered patch that read, "Turner Engineering," welded over the left pocket. Mark recognized the name. Turner Engineering had once overseen pipeline safety in the region before the company went bankrupt nearly a decade earlier. The old man stirred as Shadow pressed his muzzle against his chest. Mark leaned closer. "Sir, can you hear me?" A rasping breath escaped the old man's lips. He tried to speak, but the first attempt came out as a painful wheeze. Mark reached into the truck, checking for neck injuries before lowering the man gently back against the seat. The old man swallowed and finally forced a whisper. "My name, Eli Turner." Mark froze. Eli Turner had been spoken of in the yard before. Some of the older workers claimed he was brilliant, almost unnervingly precise, the kind of engineer who saw problems months before anyone else. Others whispered he had vanished after uncovering misconduct inside the pipeline system years ago. Rumors said he had been pushed out, discredited, maybe even threatened. But no one knew the full story. Until now. "What happened?" Mark asked quietly. Eli's fingers trembled as he reached weakly toward Mark's jacket. They pushed me off the road," he forced out. "Didn't want me getting to town. Didn't want me speaking to anyone." "Who?" Mark asked. "Who did this to you?" Eli's eyes darted toward the woods, fear flickering beneath the frost. A group, he whispered. Not just one. They've been hiding pipeline failures for years, bigger than I ever imagined. I finally found proof. Numbers, corrosion maps, dates they changed. And something worse. His breath hitched. Shadow whined a low, worried sound. Mark tried to stabilize the old man's breathing. Save your strength. We need to get you somewhere warm. But Eli clamped his weak hand around Mark's wrist with surprising force. Listen to me, he rasped. They will come for this. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a small USB drive. Its casing was cracked, the metal bent, as though someone had stepped on it or tried to destroy it. Eli shoved it into Mark's palm. Don't let them take it, he whispered. What's inside will expose everything. Mark tightened his fingers around the device. Who exactly is they, Eli? The old man's breathing grew shallow. His gaze slipped toward Shadow, as if addressing the dog was easier than addressing a man. They're already looking for him, Eli said faintly. They will come after you now. Both of you. Shadow growled again, turning toward the darkness of the ravine's edge as if he could already sense movement beyond the trees. Eli's voice faded into a thin whisper. You have no idea how deep this goes. His eyes fluttered shut. Mark checked for a pulse. It was weak but steady enough to keep him moving. He supported Eli carefully, lifting the thin and trembling frame from the wrecked truck. The man weighed less than Mark expected, almost as if years of fear had carved him down to the essentials. Mark wrapped his jacket around Eli's shoulders and began the slow ascent back up the slope, fighting the slippery ice with each step. Shadow walked beside them, alert, scanning the forest. Halfway up the hill, a noise cracked through the storm. A snapping branch, sudden, heavy. Shadow's growl deepened into a low rumble. Mark angled his body to shield Eli, adrenaline rushing through him. The trees stood silent, but the sense of being watched pressed on him like weight. He had felt this presence before in foreign deserts, just moments before danger revealed itself. But whoever or whatever had been watching them melted back into the blizzard's white curtain. Mark reached his truck, placed Eli gently in the back seat, and blasted the heater. While the engine rumbled to life, he stared at the cracked USB in his hand. A simple object, small enough to lose, small enough to hide, but according to Eli, dangerous enough for someone to kill over. He looked toward the ravine one last time. Snow began to bury the tracks of whoever had been there. Mark climbed into the driver's seat, gripping the wheel with a tightened jaw. Shadow sat upright beside him, ears still tuned to the storm, muscles still coiled for a threat that had not disappeared, only retreated. As they drove toward the nearest clinic, the USB lay in Mark's pocket like an ember refusing to burn out. For the first time since leaving Afghanistan, Mark felt the old tension return to his spine. The sense that he had stepped into a battlefield invisible to everyone else. Before they reached town, Eli stirred once more, voice barely audible. "Don't trust the supervisors," he whispered. "Some of them work for him." Mark frowned. For who? Eli's answer dissolved into unconsciousness. But one thing was certain. Someone in the shadows had tried to silence this man, and now they would come looking for the USB, and for Mark, and for Shadow. Mark gripped the steering wheel tighter as the blizzard thickened ahead. He had stumbled onto something far larger than a broken cabin or a marked map. He had found a living witness, and the people who wanted that witness gone would not stop now. The night felt colder than before as he drove into it, unaware that the storm behind him was only the beginning of a far greater one. Snow still clung to Mark's boots the next morning when he stepped into the fluorescent-lit hallway of the county clinic. The storm had not eased overnight. Drifts piled along the road, and wind battered the windows as if trying to claw its way in. Inside one of the small treatment rooms, Eli Turner lay connected to an IV line, his breathing steadier but still fragile. A nurse named Clara Jennings, a petite woman in her early 40s with sandy blonde hair pulled into a tight knot, moved around him with deliberate precision. Her face carried the softened lines of someone who had lived through years of rural medical shortages and heavy workloads. Despite exhaustion, her voice always carried a steady gentleness. She glanced at Mark as he entered. "He's stable for now," she said. "But he needs rest. Whatever happened, it shook him badly." Mark nodded with quiet gratitude. Shadow stood beside him, tail low, eyes fixed on the old man. Mark rested a hand on the dog's back, feeling the slight tremble in Shadow's muscles. "You did good last night," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if he was comforting the dog or himself. Clara approached Mark with a clipboard pressed to her chest. "We'll keep him under observation. But are you sure you don't know who harmed him?" Her blue-gray eyes searched Mark's expression with a hint of suspicion, not toward him, but toward whatever story lay behind Eli's wrecked truck. Mark hesitated. The USB in his jacket pocket felt heavier with every hour. "I'm not sure," he answered carefully, "but someone wanted him gone." Before Clara could question further, her pager beeped. She muttered an apology and hurried away, leaving Mark and Shadow alone with the beeping machines. Mark studied Eli for another moment, then leaned close and whispered, "Hang in there, old man. We'll figure out who did this." He left the clinic with Shadow trotting at his side. The sky remained the color of steel. Snowflakes drifted like ash. Mark had planned to rest for a few hours before heading into his shift, but when he arrived at the pipeline yard, exhaustion was the least of his concerns. A text message awaited him on the scheduling board. "Report to supervisor's office immediately." That supervisor was Jared Collins, a man who had arrived only 3 months earlier. Jared was in his mid-30s, tall and lean with sharply cut dark hair slicked back so precisely that not a single strand ever seemed out of place. He wore tailored coats, expensive gloves, and boots that never carried dirt. His voice always hovered between polite professionalism and something colder, a tone that suggested he measured every person by their usefulness. Rumors said he came from corporate. Others whispered that he had been sent to the valley after a scandal in another district, though no one could confirm what that scandal had been. What stood out to Mark most was Jared's smile, thin, tight, and never touching his pale hazel eyes. Mark knocked once and entered the office. Jared sat behind a metal desk with his arms crossed, expression unreadable. A faint scent of coffee and disinfectant lingered in the air. Shadow stayed at Mark's heel, eyes narrowing slightly. "You're late," Jared said. Mark kept his tone steady. "Had an emergency last night. I called in." "That's not what this is about." Jared tapped a key on his laptop. "We have an incident to discuss." A video popped up on the screen. Grainy security footage showed Mark's section of the pipeline yard from 2 nights ago. The timestamp blinked at the bottom. A figure appeared near a fenced area that contained pressure regulators and old equipment awaiting repair. The figure moved quickly, head down, hood up. Jared paused the footage at the precise moment the figure turned slightly toward the camera. For a fraction of a second, the face resembled Mark's, at least enough that someone unfamiliar with him might believe it. "Care to explain?" Jared asked. "You were assigned to the opposite quadrant, yet here you are, tampering with equipment before last night's malfunction." "That's not me," Mark replied immediately. Jared leaned back. "Really? Because our system logs confirm a badge swipe in your section, and this video places you exactly where you shouldn't have been." Mark's jaw tightened. "I didn't go there, and the badge system fails all the time." "Convenient excuse," Jared said, his voice cooling further. He tapped the screen again, letting the footage loop. "Take a good look. You want to claim this isn't you?" Before Mark could respond, Shadow suddenly barked. Not a loud bark, but a sharp, pointed one. The dog stepped forward, nose almost touching the laptop screen. His hackles rose, and he let out a low growl directed not at Jared, but at the footage itself. Mark frowned and leaned in. There, barely visible, was a brief streak of light across the frame. A tiny reflection bending unnaturally at the figure's outline, as though the image had been spliced or layered incorrectly. Mark's experience with military field footage taught him the signs of digital tampering. "The lighting doesn't match," he said quietly. "Look at the shadow angle, and that reflection. Someone edited this." Jared's eyes flashed with irritation. "Are you accusing the company of falsifying evidence?" "I'm saying this video isn't real." Shadow growled again, as if to punctuate the point. Jared slammed the laptop shut. His controlled demeanor cracked for the first time. "Watch yourself, Dawson. You think you're some kind of hero because you dragged a half-frozen stranger out of a ditch? You're a night shift inspector. Replaceable. If you dig your nose where it doesn't belong, you'll lose more than this job." The threat hung in the air like a blade. Mark met Jared's glare with a calmness forged in harsher battlegrounds. If someone is sabotaging equipment, you should be worried too. Jared stood abruptly. His height allowed him to tower just slightly over Mark, though Mark appeared far steadier on his feet. "This conversation is over," he said. "You're suspended pending review. Turn in your ID badge." Mark stiffened. "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that I said so." Shadow's growl deepened, but Mark placed a quiet hand on the dog's head. He removed the badge slowly, set it on the desk, and stepped back. The acrid taste of injustice settled on his tongue, but he swallowed it. There was no point escalating with Jared in this moment. As Mark exited the office, he caught sight of another worker entering the hallway. A man named Douglas Rains, often called Doug. Doug was in his late 50s, stocky, with a weathered face and a gray beard that looked like steel wool. His brown eyes carried something wary, as though he had seen too many supervisors come and go with too many broken promises. Doug gave Mark a subtle nod, the kind that said he didn't buy Jared's accusations, but understood the risk of speaking up. Doug kept his head low, as most workers did when corporate pushed too hard. Mark continued walking, Shadow beside him. His pulse throbbed beneath his jacket, anger building like steam within a sealed pipe. Someone wanted him out of the way. Someone who feared what Eli Turner might reveal, and someone with access to the yard's cameras and badge logs. Shadow nudged him gently, sensing his frustration. Mark exhaled slowly. "We'll figure this out," he murmured. As he reached the truck and opened the door, He felt the USB shift in his pocket. Whatever truth it held had already started a chain of events he could no longer avoid. And Jared Collins was only the first barrier in his path. The wind pummeled the treetops as Mark turned his truck back toward the forest clearing. Snow drifted across the road in veils of white, and the sky hung low, as if the mountains themselves were bracing for something unwelcome. Shadow sat alert in the passenger seat, posture rigid, ears pointed forward. The dog seemed to sense that the truth, whatever shape it took, was buried somewhere in those woods, waiting to be uncovered. Suspended from work and threatened by Jared, Mark had only one path left. Follow the trail Eli Turner started. The memory of the old engineer's rasping voice echoed through him. They will come for this. They will come for you. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel. He wished he could forget the battlefield instincts that had followed him home. But tonight he was grateful for them. Something in this valley stank of danger. The truck rolled to a stop beside the tree line. The snow had deepened since the night before, softening tracks and swallowing the shapes of fallen branches. Mark stepped out, shoulders hunched against the cold, shadow leaping into the snow ahead of him. Together they pushed through the forest until the ruined cabin came into view. It looked worse in daylight, or what little daylight the storm allowed. The roof sagged under layers of snow. The broken door swayed weakly on its hinge. The wind whistled through the shattered windows. Mark paused at the threshold, letting his eyes adjust to the dim interior. Nothing had been disturbed since their last visit, but something in the air felt unsettled, too still, too quiet. Shadow sniffed along the wall, then to the table where the map once lay. His body tensed. His tail stiffened. He growled softly, pacing in tight circles. "What is it?" Mark whispered. Shadow didn't answer with sound. He answered with movement. He trotted to the center of the cabin, placed his paw firmly on a section of the wooden floor, and scratched. Mark approached, frowning. The wood beneath Shadow's claws sounded hollow, old, thin. Shadow scratched again, more insistently this time. Mark knelt and pressed his palm to the floorboards. The wood was brittle, soft with rot. He pulled out a rusted crowbar he'd brought from the truck and wedged it beneath one of the warped planks. The board cracked loudly, splintering into jagged pieces. Beneath it lay another board, darker and older, patched with rusted nails, and beneath that, metal. Shadow barked once, sharp and decisive. Mark cleared the remaining debris, exposing a rectangular steel door built into the ground. The hinges had nearly rusted through, and the handle was loose, but it was unmistakably a hatch. Someone had gone to great effort to conceal it. With a grunt, Mark heaved the hatch open. Dust and cold air rose from the darkness below. A narrow wooden ladder descended into a cramped underground room. Mark shone his flashlight down, sweeping the beam across concrete walls blackened by old scorch marks. Burn marks. Something had been burned down there. Shadow moved to the edge of the hatch, sniffing deeply, then began descending the ladder before Mark could stop him. The dog's trust in his instincts outweighed fear. Mark followed quickly, boots creaking against the weak rungs. The space below was small, no larger than an old storm shelter, but every inch of it told a story. Stacks of binders lay charred, half-melted. Rolled engineering blueprints had fused into unreadable lumps. Metal filing cabinets stood warped, their drawers open and gutted like empty ribs. Ash coated the floor in thin layers. Someone had tried to destroy everything, but someone else, maybe Eli, had hidden this place first. Shadow sniffed along the wall, pausing at a corner where a metal box lay half buried under a collapsed shelf. Mark cleared the debris. The box wasn't burned, only dented. He pried it open. Inside were several loose pages spared from the fire, yellowed with age but still legible. Engineering logs from 1997. Notes on pipeline stress fractures. Safety reports marked urgent. Multiple signatures, some familiar, some not. And then, a photograph. Shadow growled the moment Mark lifted it. It showed a group of engineers standing in front of a pipeline construction segment. 5 men and 1 woman, smiling, arms crossed, wearing hard hats from the late 90s. Eli Turner stood on the far left, younger but instantly recognizable with his square jaw and serious expression. But it wasn't Eli's face that mattered. Someone had circled a man near the center of the photograph with red ink. The circled man was tall, with neatly parted dark hair and an unsettlingly patient smile. His cheekbones were sharp, and his eyes seemed almost amused, even in the stillness of a printed image. He wore a tailored coat instead of standard work gear, as if he had come to observe rather than participate. Something in his expression hinted at calculation rather than camaraderie. Beneath the photograph, in hurried handwriting, were 3 words. He is still here. Mark stared at the circled face, feeling the hairs rise on the back of his neck. Whoever the man was, his presence in the photo connected Eli to something long buried, and something dangerous. Shadow pawed at another stack of half-burned files. Mark sifted through them carefully. One document survived with only its edges charred. It appeared to be a memo from 1997, warning of a major structural flaw in the pipeline's early design. The memo was addressed to a project oversight director, the name smudged, unreadable. But the date mattered. This was nearly 3 decades ago. Why would an old flaw resurface now? Why would someone hide documents this old? Why try to kill Eli over them? As Mark pieced through the remnants, Shadow trotted toward the far wall and began scratching again, this time at a narrow crack between concrete blocks. Mark moved closer and saw faint etchings near the floor. Numbers and initials carved by hand, possibly by someone trapped or hiding. E.T. 1999. Eli Turner. A small arrow carved beneath the initials pointed toward a thin slit in the wall, as if indicating a hiding spot. Mark reached inside and retrieved a metal cylinder, a small drafting tube no longer than his forearm. Inside were blueprints, brittle with age but intact. The designs reflected early pipeline schematics, including deviations from approved construction models. Someone had altered the original plans. Someone with authority. As Mark carefully tucked the cylinder under his coat, he heard a faint sound above them, the creak of wood, the whisper of weight shifting across the cabin floor. Shadow's ears shot upward, his body tensed. Mark put a hand on the dog's collar. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Someone was in the cabin. Mark's pulse thudded. There was only one way out of the underground room, and he could hear the floorboards groaning softly above them, as if someone were testing each step, searching the cabin, or waiting. Shadow growled, low and controlled. Mark extinguished his flashlight. The dark enveloped them. He listened, breath held. The footsteps paused directly above the hatch. Then, unmistakably, the sound of a boot kicking snow off a step. A shadow moved past the cracks of light around the hatch frame. Mark waited for the hatch to rip open, for a weapon to appear, for a voice to shout. But moments later, the footsteps retreated. Slow at first, then fading entirely into the storm outside. Mark didn't move for nearly a full minute. When he finally climbed the ladder and pushed the hatch open cautiously, the cabin was empty, but fresh boot prints led away into the woods. Someone had been watching, someone who knew, someone who had come looking for exactly what Mark and Shadow just found. The storm eased by morning, leaving behind a pale sky stretched thin over the valley. Snow blanketed everything in quiet white, softening the outlines of danger but never truly hiding them. Mark parked his truck behind his cabin, choosing a spot tucked between two pines where passing drivers on the road couldn't easily spot it. After what happened at the underground room, caution had become instinct. Shadow leapt out and sniffed the air, posture tense but curious. The dog looked back at Mark as if urging him to hurry. They both knew time was bleeding away. Inside the cabin, Mark locked the door, closed the curtains, and set the cracked USB drive on his small wooden table. The device looked fragile, bent near the connector and split along one side. He plugged it into his old laptop carefully, half expecting sparks or nothing at all, but after a few seconds, the computer's screen flickered, then pulsed with life. A folder appeared, ET Archive. Shadow sat beside him, head resting on Mark's knee. Mark opened the folder, hundreds of files, scans of engineering reports, photos of corroded joints, handwritten notes detailing inspection fraud, audio memos labeled by date. But one file stood apart, a video labeled simply, "If something happens to me." Mark clicked it. The screen filled with Eli Turner's face, recorded in dim light. He looked older than he had in the clinic, as though the weight of decades hung on his shoulders. His voice trembled, not from weakness, but from fear carefully contained. "This is Eli Turner," he began. "If you're watching this, then I couldn't get the truth out myself." Shadow whined softly. Mark pressed his hand gently on the dog's back. Eli continued, "The pipeline under this valley is failing. Corrosion levels far exceed the numbers the company reported. If even one of the compromised segments ruptures during winter, the entire system could ignite. Fuel, ice, trapped gases, it would sweep across the town like a rolling fire line." He swallowed hard. "People won't have time to evacuate." Mark felt his gut twist. He had inspected those lines for months. If what Eli said was true, then every resident, every child, every worker, every elderly man and woman lived next to an invisible bomb. Eli's recorded face darkened. "I tried to warn them years ago. They shut me down. They said I was exaggerating, paranoid, but I wasn't the only one who noticed." He reached off screen and held up a photo, the same group photograph Mark found underground. Eli tapped the circled man. "This is Roland Miles." Mark leaned closer. The name landed heavily. Roland Miles. He'd heard it whispered once by two retired yard workers months ago, spoken with a strange mix of fear and respect. A man who had been the oversight director in the late 90s. A perfectionist. Brilliant. Ruthless in his standards. And according to rumors, the man who vanished one winter and was never seen again. Some said he died in a landslide. Others claimed he stole money and fled. Nobody really knew, but here Eli spoke of him as though he never left. Roland discovered discrepancies in pipeline construction, unauthorized changes to safety valves, hidden budget cuts. He confronted executives. Days later, he disappeared. Eli's voice dropped. "But I don't believe he died. I've never believed it." Mark's pulse thudded. The next part of the recording looked different, shakier, as though Eli had filmed it in secret. The video showed scanned documents dated just 3 months ago, meeting agendas, technical memos. And then another clip appeared, grainy and distorted, filmed through what seemed to be a cracked phone screen. A conference room, figures sitting around a table, and among them, Mark froze. Roland Miles, older, with deeper lines around his eyes, but unmistakably the same man from the 1997 photo. His once neatly parted hair was grayer now, thinner, but the calculating smile remained. He wore a dark suit and carried himself with the posture of a man still in control, still confident, still unchallenged. But the file was only 5 seconds long before the footage abruptly cut off. Eli's voice returned, shaken. "He's alive. I know it. And he's part of whatever they're covering now." The screen went black. Mark sat back, breath unsteady. Shadow nudged his elbow, sensing the shift in his energy. The laptop's faint hum sounded unnaturally loud in the small cabin. Roland Miles, a ghost from 20 years past. A man who should have been dead. Why was he appearing at a meeting 3 months ago? Who else was part of this? And how deep did the cover-up go? Mark replayed the brief footage again. Each time, Roland's calm expression unsettled him more. It wasn't the look of a man hiding from danger. It was the look of someone orchestrating events from behind the curtain. Someone who believed himself untouchable. A sudden knock on the door jolted Mark out of thought. 3 slow raps. Shadow sprang to his feet, stance defensive, teeth barely bared. Mark motioned him back and approached the door cautiously. Through the peephole, he saw a woman bundled in a heavy parka, snow on her shoulders. Her face was half-shadowed by her hood, but he recognized the narrow frame and soft features. It was Clara Jennings, the clinic nurse. He unlocked the door a crack. "Clara, what are you doing out here?" Clara pulled down her hood, revealing her pale, wind-chapped face and tired eyes. "I didn't know where else to go," she said, breath clouding in the cold. "Something happened at the clinic." Mark opened the door fully. "Is Eli all right?" Clara stepped inside quickly, glancing behind her as if afraid someone followed. "He's missing." Mark froze. Shadow growled. Clara's voice began to shake. "He was there this morning, weak but stable. When I returned an hour later, his bed was empty. His chart was gone, and the security camera facing his hallway. The feed cut out for exactly 6 minutes." Mark clenched his fists. The same people who pushed him off the road came back for him. Clara nodded, fear tightening her expression. "I asked Jared if he knew anything. He brushed me off, but..." She hesitated, then continued. "There was a man in the waiting room earlier. Tall, silver hair, expensive coat. Looked like he didn't belong in a small-town clinic. He asked the receptionist questions about Eli before he left." She searched Mark's face. "Does that name, Roland Miles, mean anything to you?" Mark's breath caught. Did he look like someone who's been in charge his whole life? Clara nodded slowly. He had that sort of presence. Shadow paced anxiously, glancing from Mark to the door. Clara took a tentative step forward. "Mark, what's going on? Why would anyone want to take an old engineer?" Mark looked at the USB still plugged into his laptop, at the frozen frame of Roland Miles's face, at Shadow, who never doubted danger when he sensed it. He exhaled, steady and grim, because Eli wasn't supposed to survive long enough to tell anyone. The cabin fell quiet except for the sound of wind pressing against the eaves. Outside, the forest stood still and cold, waiting. Somewhere in that frozen silence, powerful men were moving their pieces across a hidden board, and Mark Dawson had just found himself in the center of it. But he wasn't alone. Shadow stood ready, and Eli's final message had already changed everything. Snow fell silently over the valley that night, layering the world in a fragile calm that never quite reached Mark Dawson's bones. After Clara left the cabin, after the USB was unplugged and hidden beneath a loose floorboard, after he double-checked every window and deadbolt, exhaustion finally dragged him towards sleep. Yet even as he lay on the worn couch, jacket still on, boots within reach, the tension in his body never fully dissolved. Shadow lay beside him, head resting on his paws, but eyes half open, one ear twitching at every passing gust of wind. Mark drifted into a shallow rest, the kind soldiers learn to accept after too many nights in hostile terrain. His mind replayed the footage of Roland Miles, alive, confident, orchestrating something dark. He replayed Clara's fear, Eli's warnings, Jared's threats. His breath slowed. The cabin creaked softly in the cold. Snow tapped against the windows in faint rhythms. Shadow's head snapped up. A growl formed low in his chest. Not the alert bark of a dog hearing wildlife. A warning. Shadow stood, muscles going rigid. His nose lifted, inhaling scents Mark could never detect. The dog stepped toward the door, then toward the window, then back toward Mark, caught between protecting and waking. Outside, faint crunching sounds broke the quiet. Footsteps. More than one. Shadow pushed his paws onto the couch and nudged Mark's shoulder hard, then harder, until Mark jolted awake. Shadow's eyes were wide and fierce, glowing in the dim light. Mark whispered, "What is it?" Shadow barked once, muted, urgent. Mark swung his legs off the couch and reached instinctively for the small steel baton he kept near the wood stove. Before he could stand fully, the cabin's back door rattled. Someone tested the handle. Metal scraped faintly, as if tools were being used. Shadow sprang toward the hallway, bracing himself like a soldier taking position. Mark moved quickly, scanning shadows, calculating exits. He extinguished the single lamp, plunging the cabin into darkness. Another sound, this one unmistakable. A quiet voice outside the door. "Cut the feed! On my mark!" Then a click. The cabin's exterior circuit breaker snapped. Lights dead, power gone. Shadow lunged toward the window beside the kitchen sink, teeth sinking into the exposed electrical line feeding a small control panel the attackers were trying to override from outside. The dog yanked hard, ripping the cable from its mount. Sparks hissed silently in the snow outside. The attackers cursed. Shadow's instincts had been faster than any alarm system. The front door shook violently. A boot slammed into it. Mark crouched, gripping the baton. Memories surged. Night raids, desert ambushes, the metallic taste of adrenaline. But this wasn't a battlefield of his choosing. This was his home, the only place he had left. A familiar voice shouted from outside, muffled but clear. "Dawson, open up! We just want to talk!" Jared Collins. Mark clenched his jaw. Shadow barked, loud and explosive, as if announcing that anyone entering would pay dearly. Jared's voice sharpened. "Dawson, do not make this difficult." The doorframe creaked as another heavy strike landed. Someone large, one of the two silhouettes shifting in the storm, was preparing to break it down. Mark whispered, "Shadow. Back." The dog moved beside him, trembling with ready fury. Another slam. The wood cracked. Mark felt the old instinct rising. Do not wait to be cornered. Move before the enemy locks the trap. The cabin had a small cellar door leading beneath the floor, a storage area for firewood and tools. A long-forgotten hatch Mark rarely used. He motioned toward it. Shadow understood immediately, trotting toward the hatch while Mark shoved aside a rug and pulled it open. But before they descended, the front door burst inward with a splintering roar. Snow and cold air flooded inside. Jared entered first, wearing a thick black coat over a tailored suit, face flushed with anger. Behind him were two men Mark didn't recognize, both large, both built like enforcers. One had a shaved head and a scar slicing through his eyebrow. The other wore a dark beanie and had a crooked nose that suggested a broken past. Their expressions lacked hesitation. They were not here to argue. Jared pointed directly at Mark. "You have something Roland wants. Hand it over, and this ends." Shadow stood between Mark and the intruders, teeth bared, body lowered into a protective stance. Mark didn't respond. He waited, calculated. Scar eyebrow stepped forward. "Get the dog out of the way." Shadow lunged before he finished the sentence. He launched himself like a coiled spring, jaws clamping onto the man's forearm with crushing force. The attacker howled and fell backward, slamming against a shelf that toppled loudly. Shadow didn't let go. Not until Mark shouted, "Shadow, move!" The dog released and dashed back to Mark's side, fur bristling. The second man charged, rage overriding caution. Mark swung the steel baton with controlled precision, striking the man's wrist. The blow echoed sharply. The man cursed and stumbled, clutching his hand. Jared stepped back, face twisting with something between frustration and fear. "Roland said you would be a problem," he hissed. "He doesn't want you digging into this. You were supposed to keep your head down." Mark answered with a coldness forged from years of combat. "I didn't kill a man's career. You did." Jared's eyes narrowed. "You don't understand what's at stake." Shadow barked again, long, fierce, warning Mark to move. Mark grabbed the dog's collar and dove through the hatch into the cellar. The attackers lunged forward, but Mark yanked the hatch shut from below, locking the metal bar in place. Heavy boots hit the floor above. "Find another way down!" Jared shouted. "He's not getting away!" Mark grabbed the emergency lantern stored beside the stacked firewood. Shadow stood ready beside him as they navigated the cramped cellar toward a narrow crawl space that led into the woods. It was an old maintenance tunnel from decades ago, barely enough room for a man to slide through, but perfect for disappearing. Behind them, Jared and the enforcers hammered at the hatch, each strike growing louder. Mark whispered, "Go, Shadow." Shadow crawled forward first, squeezing into the tunnel. Mark followed, dragging himself along the cold dirt. His shoulders scraped the low beams, and soil rained down with each movement. The world above shook with violence. Then, silence. Mark froze. Shadow's ears flattened. A final shout echoed from above, Jared's voice high with frustration. "Roland warned you, Dawson. Walk away before this buries you." A sentence heavy with truth, heavy with threat. They crawled until the tunnel opened into the snowy woods behind the cabin. Mark climbed out, breathing hard. Shadow shook off dirt and snow. then pressed his body against Mark's leg protectively. The night was no longer quiet. It was alive with pursuit. Shadow looked up at Mark, eyes burning with loyalty and warning. They would not be safe here anymore. But one thing had become clear. Jared was working directly for Roland Miles. And Roland wasn't just hiding. He was controlling everything, from the shadows, from behind the lies, from beneath decades of vanished history. Mark placed a hand on Shadow's head. "We're not running," he whispered. "We're finding the truth." Shadow barked softly, as if promising to see it through. Together they disappeared into the winter darkness, hunted but unbroken. Dawn broke in a muted gray, spreading over the valley like a tired breath. The snowstorm had passed, but its shadow lingered in the biting air and the brittle silence that followed. Mark and Shadow had taken refuge in an abandoned ranger shed deep in the woods. Inside, Mark knelt on the cold floor, sorting through the documents he had rescued from Eli's secret bunker. The blueprint tube, charred scraps of memos, the group photograph, the USB. Every piece of evidence felt heavier than it should, as if each page carried the weight of the entire town. Shadow lay beside him, resting but alert. Every few minutes the dog lifted his head to listen, his amber eyes narrowing. He had not relaxed since the attack. Neither had Mark. They both knew time was running out. By midday, Clara contacted Mark using a prepaid phone he had bought earlier that morning. Her voice trembled as she whispered into the line. "The town council is calling an emergency meeting about the pipeline tonight. People are scared, Mark. Rumors are spreading. Some are saying the company hid something. Some are blaming the workers. Others think Eli is missing because of sabotage." Mark listened quietly. Clara continued, "If you have proof, bring it. They need the truth." Mark ended the call with a slow exhale and looked at Shadow. "Looks like we're done hiding." Shadow rose to his feet, tail stiff, posture ready. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, Mark and Shadow walked toward the town's community hall. The building stood modest, wooden, painted white years ago, but now faded into pale beige. Its single bell tower rose against the darkening sky. People crowded inside, bundled in coats, faces strained with tension. Families sat together, workers gathered in small knots, and the elderly whispered among themselves. The room quieted the moment Mark entered. Shadow trotted beside him, head high, watching every face. Some people knew Mark from the pipeline yard. Others recognized Shadow, the dog who accompanied him everywhere. But no one had ever seen the veteran look like this. Jaw set, eyes determined, carrying a folder thick enough to change everything. At the front of the hall stood the town safety committee, a group of 7 appointed residents. Among them was Sarah Whitmore, a woman in her early 50s with tall, slender stature, olive-toned skin, and long, dark hair streaked with silver. Her features were sharp, and her quiet authority commanded the room. A former firefighter, Sarah was known for blunt honesty and a protective nature toward the community. Tonight, worry carved deeper lines around her eyes. "Mark Dawson," she said. "We heard you requested the floor." Mark nodded and stepped forward. Shadow sat at his side, ears high, eyes fixed on the room. The lights dimmed. Mark connected the USB to the projector provided. He began with the pipeline reports, Eli's written memos, the stress fracture analysis, the corrosion photos. Gasps murmured through the hall as images of rust-eaten metal appeared on screen. showing weaknesses no one had been told about. Sarah folded her arms tightly. These are severe structural risks. Why weren't these disclosed? Mark answered. Because they would cost the company millions in repairs and shutdown time. The audience stirred with discontent. Mark continued, showing the underground safety notes from 1997, the circled engineer in the photograph, and the burned bunker under the cabin. Then he played the final piece of evidence, the USB video. Eli's recorded confession filled the hall. His voice, tired but resolute, echoed across the wooden room. Some people pressed hands to their mouths. A few looked away, unable to watch as the old man spoke of danger, corruption, and sabotage. The tension thickened as Eli mentioned the worst possibility, the explosion that could take the town with it. People whispered urgently among themselves. Someone muttered, "Where is Eli now?" Clara, seated near the back, lowered her eyes. Mark said softly, "They took him." Silence fell like a dropped stone. Then Mark played the 5 seconds of grainy footage. Roland Miles appeared on screen, alive, unchanged by the 20 years since his disappearance, except for age etched into his features. He sat at a conference table, speaking to unseen executives. A collective gasp rippled through the hall. Someone whispered, "Is that really him?" Sarah leaned closer, studying the still frame. Roland Miles. But he vanished. Everyone said he died. Before Mark could respond, the back doors of the hall creaked open. People turned. A man stepped inside, tapping a cane lightly against the wooden floor. Snow clung to his long wool coat. Under the hood of his winter hat, strands of steely gray hair framed a face carved with sharp angles and cold intelligence. His eyes were an icy blue, focused and calm, scanning the room with unsettling confidence. Roland Miles, alive. Older, but unmistakably the same man circled in the photograph. Shadow growled immediately, body rigid, hackles rising. Roland walked to the center aisle without hurry. The hall parted around him, people shrinking back in a mixture of disbelief and fear. He stopped a few steps from Mark and faced the entire audience. His voice was steady. "You all saw the evidence, so let me tell you the part Eli never understood." Sarah stepped forward, fists clenched. "Explain yourself." Roland's gaze moved across the room. If the pipeline fails, people die. But if the company declares the truth and shuts down operations, thousands lose their jobs. Families starve. The valley collapses. I kept the secret because the alternative was worse. Murmurs spread among the townspeople. Confusion, doubt. Some looked at Mark as though seeking guidance. Others stared at Roland with the hesitant respect one gives a man who once held authority. Roland continued, "I didn't disappear 20 years ago. I was reassigned, quietly, because I knew things the board didn't want public, and they needed someone to manage the risk without headlines. That required silence." Shadow growled again. Roland looked at the dog with a faint hint of disdain. "It appears you inherited a very attentive animal, Mr. Dawson." Mark stood straighter. "Eli Turner tried to warn the town. You tried to kill him." Roland's expression barely changed. Eli was going to expose the truth without understanding the cost. He forced my hand. A wave of anger surged through the room. A man in the front row shouted, "You endangered all of us!" Roland slammed his cane once, silencing the hall. "I protected you. Without my intervention, the town would have collapsed from economic ruin years ago." Sarah stepped forward, fury simmering in her eyes. "Saving a company is not the same as saving lives." Roland gave her a thin, humorless smile. Lives tied to wages must also be protected. Mark watched the crowd carefully. He saw fear, anger, confusion, emotions tugging in opposite directions. Roland's words had struck a nerve, creating a fracture in the room. Some townspeople supported Mark, demanding justice and truth. Others hesitated, afraid of losing everything they depended on. Mark raised his voice above the growing noise. Keeping silent only delays disaster. The pipeline is failing. If it explodes, the town still dies. But this time with no warning. Roland countered sharply. The risk is being managed. Mark stepped closer, face unyielding. Your men tried to kill me. They kidnapped Eli. You broke into my home. Roland's gaze hardened. You left me no choice. Shadow barked. The hall erupted into shouts. Some people demanded an investigation. Others worried about the consequences of exposing corporate wrongdoing. The tension thickened until it felt suffocating. Sarah raised both hands. Enough! Silence fell once more. Her voice carried firm authority. Tonight, this town decides. Do we stand by truth no matter the risk? Or do we protect secrecy and hope disaster never reaches us? Dozens of frightened faces turned toward Mark, toward Roland, toward each other. The town stood at a crossroads, and before the night ended, someone would make a choice that changed everything. For a long moment, the hall remained suspended between disbelief and fear. The kind of stillness that comes when a community realizes the world it trusted has already begun to fracture. Snow tapped against the windows, muffled and rhythmic, like a heartbeat urging the people inside to finally decide their fate. Roland Miles stood at the center aisle, his gloved hand gripping the top of his cane, posture straight despite his age. His pale blue eyes swept the room, waiting to see whether his logic had taken root. Mark Dawson stepped forward instead. His voice carried through the hall, not loud, but steady, forged from years of speaking only when truth mattered. Saving a company by putting lives at risk isn't saving anyone, he said. Protecting people means being honest with them, letting them choose what kind of world they want to live in. A hush settled over the crowd. Shadow walked ahead of Mark, weaving through the rows of chairs. He stopped beside an elderly man wearing a patched brown coat. The man had a deeply lined face, soft gray eyes, and skin weathered from years repairing fences on the outskirts of town. His hands trembled slightly as Shadow nudged him gently, placing his warm head on the man's knee. The old man let out a breath that echoed softly across the room. Sarah Whitmore noticed it first, the way every tense pair of shoulders loosened, the way the growing storm of fear quieted, the way people leaned in instead of pulling back. She understood what Mark had not said out loud. Sometimes a dog's faith could reach farther than a man's voice. The old man rose slowly. His voice was gravelly, yet full of heart. We can't hide behind secrets anymore, he said. If the pipeline fails, we all suffer. If we fix it together, we all survive. A woman near the back stood next. Martha Dean, a bakery owner with warm hazel eyes and flour-dusted brown hair tied in a bun. Her voice trembled with emotion. I'll donate whatever I can. Money, meals for workers, just tell me what's needed. Doug Raines, the longtime pipeline worker with a steel wool beard, rose to his feet with a heavy sigh. I'll volunteer, he said. I've been patching that line for 20 years. I know where the weak points are. One by one, voices echoed across the room. Count me in. We can't let this continue. We protect our own. Sarah stepped forward, her tall frame commanding the room. Then it's decided. The town forms a volunteer task force. We repair the pipeline ourselves. No more silence. No more waiting for someone else to save us. All eyes turned toward Roland. His expression, once carved from cold stone, finally wavered. The weight of decades rested in the small tremor beneath his gloves. He looked not at the town, but at Mark, and for the first time, there was no superiority in his gaze, only exhaustion, regret, and the painful knowledge that a lie he believed necessary had slowly consumed him. Roland tapped his cane once, a quiet gesture of surrender. "I thought I could keep this under control," he said. "Protecting jobs, protecting families, but I failed to protect the truth." His voice softened. "If you choose to repair the pipeline, you'll need more than volunteers. You'll need schematics, flow readings, access codes. I have them, all of them." The room stirred. Roland continued, "I'll turn over every document, every detail the company buried, and I'll help guide the repair work, if you'll let me." Mark studied him for a long beat. "This doesn't erase what you've done." "No," Roland whispered. "It doesn't." Shadow stepped closer to Mark, leaning against his leg as if sensing the gravity of the moment. Sarah broke the silence. "This town believes in redemption, but redemption requires honesty." She extended a hand. "Work with us, not above us." Roland nodded, shoulders lowering for the first time. What followed was a flurry of collective motion, unlike anything the valley had seen in decades. By the next morning, the entire town mobilized. Volunteers cleared snow from the pipeline service roads. Retired welders returned to their old tools with determination in their eyes. Young adults formed relay teams to carry supplies. Martha's Bakery produced hot bread and soups for workers. A mechanic loaned portable heaters. Someone donated heavy-duty gloves. Someone else donated floodlights. Kids hung handmade signs outside homes that read, "We fix this together." Mark and Shadow led the frontline crews. The veterans' experience in crisis zones gave structure and direction, while Shadow's uncanny senses became invaluable. Several times, the dog signaled where the earth vibrated from internal pressure, or where gas seeped beneath the snow. Workers began calling him their guardian compass. Roland, though visibly weighed down by years of secrets, worked tirelessly beside them, guiding teams through outdated schematics and revealing hidden bypass valves long removed from public documents. He moved with the precision of a man atoning with every step. Clara visited often, bringing medical help and quietly checking for any news of Eli. Days blurred together under the frozen sky. The town worked through snow, wind, and bitter cold. But slowly, the line was reinforced. Weak joints were replaced. Hazard sections were shut down and rerouted. The rust-eaten segments Mark once inspected were restored to safe condition. One evening, after nearly 3 weeks of relentless effort, a convoy of trucks arrived at the clinic. Eli Turner stepped out. His face was pale, thinner than before, but alive. Clara had located him after anonymous tips. Someone within Roland's circle had a change of heart and freed him, leaving him near a rest stop with directions to town. When Eli saw Mark and Shadow waiting, he broke into tears he struggled to hide. "You saved them," he whispered. "You saved all of us." Mark shook his head. "No, the town saved itself." Shadow pressed his head into Eli's hand, a gesture that felt like both forgiveness and welcome. Within weeks, Safety inspectors, independent ones this time, confirmed that the pipeline was no longer an imminent threat. Winter passed without disaster. Families slept through the night without wondering if the ground beneath them hummed with danger. In early spring, the town gathered once more at the community hall, this time with warmth instead of fear. Doug proposed building a community response center, funded by the volunteer donations that kept coming long after repairs ended. A place where town members could train, prepare, and protect each other. Sarah suggested a name, Shadow's Watch, to honor the dog who never hesitated, who sensed danger before anyone else, who pulled Mark from the path of secrecy into the light of community action. The inscription beneath it would read, "Where light is kept alive." Mark tried to refuse the honor, but the people insisted. The town saw what he couldn't, that a man who walked through war and grief had helped them rediscover hope. When spring thawed the last remnants of snow, a small ceremony was held outside the new center. Mark stood with Shadow at his side, the dog's fur shimmering in the sun. Roland, though still burdened by the past, attended quietly, contributing blueprints for future safety upgrades. Clara stood with Eli, whose recovery had returned color to his face. Mark looked at the crowd, neighbors, workers, children, and felt something he had not in many years: belonging. Shadow barked once, tail wagging proudly as the ribbon was cut. And for the first time since returning from war, Mark Dawson knew the valley was no longer merely a place he lived. It was home. In the end, the town learned a timeless truth. When people stand together, fear loses its power. Mark, Shadow, and the valley's families proved that even the deepest troubles can be healed when hearts unite, when honesty replaces silence, and when courage rises from ordinary lives. Their story reminds us that miracles rarely arrive as thunder or lightning. Sometimes they come as a loyal dog's bark, a neighbor's helping hand, or a moment when strangers choose to protect one another. And in those small moments, God moves quietly, guiding us toward hope. As this chapter closes, may His grace watch over you and your loved ones. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs encouragement today. Leave a comment, join the conversation, and subscribe to follow more journeys of faith, courage, and second chances. May God bless you, keep you, and light your path forward.